Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook was known for Shita when studying Parshat HaShavua, that there are groups. One of the paradigmatic examples of the grouping of Parshiot is Yitro Mishpatim, the Kabbalah HaTorah. Within Kabbalah HaTorah, you have Kabbalah HaMitzvos. And I want to share with you an insight of Maharal Prague to be able to help us understand. A lot of people describe themselves as observant, religious, Shomer Torah, mitzvot. Why are you observant? Because I do the mitzvot. Why do I do the mitzvot? Let's describe that. Let's discuss that. 2 points. Number one, what is the motivation behind my performance of mitzvot? Number one model we found by the mitzvah of Kibbud Avim. Last week's parsha, it says, Kabir Tavicha V'Atimecha. But in Sefer Dvarim, in Vayet Chanan, V'Daseret HaDibrot, it says, Kabir Tavicha V'Atimecha, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. The Mefarshim want to know, why does it say Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, as you are commanded by Hashem your God? It said about every mitzvah. The Aruch HaShulchan, Rav Yechiel Mechel Epstein in Siman Reish Mem explains, because I could have thought it's a type of mitzvah that everybody does. The foreign nations do, non-Jews. Honoring parents, it's logical. Hakarat HaTov, look what they've been doing for you. The Torah has to go out of its way, to be able to say no. Even for mitzvot like Ben Adam L'Chaveiro, even mitzvot of Kibbud Avim, which might have an element of Ben Adam L'Chaveiro, one has to do them L'Shem Yichud, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. That's one way. Chaim Shmulevitz, the Aruch HaShulchan here, looks at certain mitzvot, and even mitzvot maybe Ben Adam L'Chaveiro you have to do, the motivation is because God commanded me. The other possible extreme might be, as we're approaching Adar, is Mishloach Manot. Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sri Yesh, asked the question, why is there no bracha not only on Kibbud Avim, there's no bracha on Mishloach Manot? There's a fascinating machloket for the reason behind Mishloach Manot, whether it's because of that we need to help people with the Su'udah, or the other answer based on a Chatam Sofer is Laharbot Avavarei, to be able to increase love amongst the Jews. Why do we need that for Purim time? Because we know Haman's the big accuser of Am Yisrael explains, Am Mefuzar Meforad. We are a scattered nation. Therefore, our rabbi said we have to have Mishloach Manot. Explains Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, because of that motivation of the mitzvah, if we Chazal would have instituted a bracha, it would have been mafchit ahava. It would have took the feet underneath the actual teeth of the mitzvah, because the actual mitzvah is to increase love, and by doing the mitzvah only because God tells me to do it, you're actually lessening the amount of love that comes between us. So you have this other extreme, that the reason I'm doing mitzvot is because I want to do it. In certain mitzvot, that's okay. That's the way it should be, like in Mishloach Manot. I think for the contemporary Jew, the Maharal Prague is some sort of middle approach of these two bookends. The Maharal Prague we see in 3 different places. In last week's parsha, in this week's parsha, and also in Parshat Vayikra, on a pasuk of V'im. This week's parsha, it says, V'im kesef taveh et ami. If a person needs a loan, then you should loan it to the person who needs it. It says V'im though, it sounds like if you want to, it's a reshut. Furthermore, at the end of last week's parsha, where it talks about building mizbeach towards Hashem, it said V'im mizbach avanim ta'aseli. If you will build an altar of stones, make sure not to hew it, and because you're putting the sword above it, and that is not good for the mizbeach, which is atones, and we know the sword cuts off life. Again, the pasuk in Parshat Kitavot says you have to build an avanim shleimot tivneh. You have to build the mizbeach of avanim. What does it mean, V'im? The third example is V'im by the Minchat HaOmer, by the Korban HaOmer, chapter 2 of Vayikra. V'im Minchat Bikurim Takriv. What do you mean V'im? You have to. This is Rashi in these places says that every time, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, every time it says V'im, it's optional, except for these 3 cases. It's kasher. You have to do it. The obvious question the Maharal Prague says is, if you have to do it, The Torah should have said kasher. Do it, you have to do it. Why does it say ve'im? The Maharal Miprag has a thesis that the overall idea of observing mitzvot, the ideal is you have to have 2 komo, 2 floors, 2 levels. You need the kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. You need to do it because God commanded you to do it. You're not going to always feel the naaseh v'nishma like we talked about last week. You're not going to always feel that ratzon and desire and closeness. And that's part of being a religious Jew. And therefore you have to, that's commitment. Kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. But then the highest level is to build on that Koma and say, I'm not only doing it because I'm part of the halachic system. Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. And I understand that I have to follow the halacha, but also because I want to do it. And he says that that's true by all mitzvot, that's the ideal. But if I only did it, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, I'm yotzei my mitzvah. Except for these 3. These 3, if I don't have this derech of vi'im, of wanting to do it also, there's an etzem lakuna, a chisaron in the actual mitzvah. And he explains why, based on each one, that the mitzvah of halva is similar to tzedakah. You have to want it. You have to be able, lo yira levavcha, or the concept of being able to avodah, that you're not a real servant if you're not also wanting and subjugating your mind. So we see this model of being able to say that I have this mitzvot, not only because kasher tzivcha, but also because I want to do it. I remember a story when I was finishing my master's in social work, and I was at a Peninsula Counseling Center in Long Island, and my supervisor was saying to me, Ari, why don't you eat eat some cake that you're giving to the elderly? And I knew that it wasn't kosher. And I held back, but finally she was pestering me, and I said to her, look, I can't. And she said to me in a very social work way, no, Rabbi. She didn't say Rabbi at that point, I was Ari. No, Ari, it's not that you can't, you choose not to. And I was like, oh. And the answer was, when I thought about it at night, is that's exactly the truth. You have these 2 elements. You have both, I can't, and I also choose not to. That's the motivation behind the mitzvot. These 2 floors, the ideal. And just to finish up, we said, not only the motivation for the mitzvot, but how do we view ourselves? What's the purpose? So I'm doing mitzvot for what? So we say the Chofetz Chaim in his introduction says, Laman tizkeru va'asitem et kol mitzvotai. For what purpose? V'item kedoshim alechem. I'm doing the mitzvot for what purpose? That I should be kadosh. For what purpose? Explains the Chofetz Chaim in his introduction. In order that we could mekabel the whole purpose of the world, which is Hashem is l'tov lanu. And if we're not, as we explained last week, if we're not on the right frequency of the Kedoshim, then you're not going to be able to accept all the goodness of Ma Hashem Shoel Mimach. What does He want all those things for? What purpose? L'tov lanu. And this, I believe, is what the Gemara in Kiddushin says. Gadol hamitzuv v'oseh yoter mishe'ena mitzuv v'oseh. The Gemara says, greater is the one who's commanded, more than the one who's magnanimous and volunteers, which seems to be counterintuitive. There are 3 interpretations. Lefi ani yodati, Tosfos and Kiddushin, Tosfos in another place, if I'm not mistaken, Avodah Zarah. The classical interpretation is, it's a Yetzer Hara. The more you're commanded, the more you have to build the Yetzer Hara and defeat your Yetzer Hara. Versus, if you're not commanded, you don't have a greater Yetzer Hara. The second interpretation, if you look at Tosfos and Kiddushin and Daf Lamed Aleph, is that it's psychological. The more that you have to have that commitment, the more you feel that you need it and you don't want to fail. Libo do'eg mitzta'er, to make sure that you're going to mess up. That's why it's a greater responsibility, the commitment. But finally, if you look at the Maharal Miprag, it's Gadol HaMitzuv v'oseh, is because when you do it yourself, who's in the center? Man is in the center. Versus, if it's Gadol HaMitzuv v'oseh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in the center. How we observe our Torah mitzvahs, our motivation, at the same time, for what are we doing it? Gadol HaMitzuv v'oseh, what the Maharal Miprag says, to be able to have HaKadosh Baruch Hu there as the baseline, to be able to see the Ein Sof that I'm trying to bring the Taken Olam and Malchut Shakai, and then obviously to bring myself into it. Afterwards, the Na'aseh v'Nishma, to be able then to bring myself into that and make sure that it's Ve'im that I do it. That is the ideal of the Torah observant Jew.